Let's get started. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Deeran and I'm the Director of Reform Scotland. You're probably used to me by now. We're now in the final full week of the Holyrood election campaign, and this is the last of our policy events with our partners at the Scottish Policy Foundation. I would say we've been really delighted with the way they've gone so far. We started with our paper and event proposing directly elected mayors, an event with Jack McConnell and Andrew Adonis as guests. And during the afternoon, we found a surprise cross-party consensus for the idea. Whether it ever ends up in legislation, that's another thing, but that was very heartening. Then came immigration, and I'm pleased to say that Heather Macaulay's expert and insightful report has sparked genuine interest from the Scottish Government, so conversations are ongoing there. And then last week's was based on the publication of our Commission on School Reform's Education Manifesto, which received widespread coverage in the newspapers and on broadcast media, so you have picked up on some of that. If you missed any of them, or you have an urge to watch again or share with others, you can find the video of each event on our website, and we're very grateful for any support and added awareness that you can give us. This week, the last event of its kind, we are looking at the future of the Scottish energy sector. We published this morning an essay by Dr. Stuart Payton, an energy expert and entrepreneur, which, if you haven't seen it, is currently at the top of our website, and a fine read it is too. It's a fascinating and clear-eyed examination of the progress being made across the renewables piece, from electrification to blue and green hydrogen, from wind to solar power, from new manufacturing techniques for hard to decarbonise sectors, to carbon capture, energy storage, that kind of thing. And what really has struck me as a non-expert watching from the sidelines is the sheer speed of development and achievement that we're now seeing. I find it hugely heartening, not to underestimate or overestimate the scale of the challenge with climate change, but you know, you can see this progress and think, well, maybe there's some hope there. But I think also there's a sense, and I've heard this from more than a few people in the energy sector, that Scotland rather missed the boat on the first wave of renewables technology and ended up being more of a consumer of technology rather than a producer. I think there's a clear determination that we won't let the next generation pass us by, and we can see that next generation starting to come through now. The Scottish Government has made a legally binding commitment that Scotland will be net zero by 2045, and this effort will be helped by the recently created Scottish National Investment Bank, which has a core mission to aid Scotland's transition to net zero. And we expect, hopefully we can find out today, we'll be investing heavily in the renewables sector. And as we all know, in November, world leaders are coming to Glasgow for COP26, where each country is expected to intensify the commitments it made in the Paris Agreement of 2015. So if we haven't conquered climate change quite yet, it's good to see a saltire flying proudly in the midst of the battle, and more of that, please. So today we have three expert guests with us to discuss this none more important subject. First, I'll introduce our author of the piece on our website, Dr. Stuart Payton, who has spent his career working in the energy industry, previously at Shell and Dana Petroleum. Stuart is now working with H2 Green, which is a Scottish-based hydrogen production, storage and delivery business. Next, we have Nicola Gordon, President of the Scottish Energy Forum and a board member at SEPA. Nicola also has a background in the oil and gas industry, having worked in various senior roles for Shell. And she tells me that back in 1980, she was the first woman to be awarded an MSc degree in petroleum engineering from Heriot-Watt University. So a groundbreaker in many ways. And last, we have what I suppose we might call the money man, although he probably won't want to be called that. David Ritchie is Executive Director for Partnerships and Engagement at the Scottish National Investment Bank, with responsibility for the bank's policy and insights, marketing and communications, and state aid functions. Prior to joining the bank, David held a number of positions in the Scottish Government, including head of the Energy Industries Division. So we'll start by asking Stuart to give an overview of what his research unearthed, and then we'll have some brief responses to that from Nicola and Stuart before moving on to questions. As usual, we'll be taking questions from the audience too, so please do send them through using the message button on Zoom. Just type them out and send them through to me, and we'll get through as many as we can over the next hour or so. And I'll just remind you again to please mute yourself unless you're one of the speakers, because it's incredibly distracting when we can hear background noise. So Stuart, I shall pass the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Chris, and good afternoon to everybody. As I was going to say, it's really good to see so many of you on the screen in front of you, and thanks very much for all the interest. As Chris said, I published a brief blog this morning with some of the issues I think it's useful we could explore this afternoon. So I'll obviously not go through that, but if people want to ask questions later, that's great. But I thought maybe could just touch on some of the key issues, and Chris has mentioned some of them already. And I think it's quite remarkable. I've worked in the oil industry for, oil and gas industry for, I don't know, 25 years, something like that. I worked with Nicola in the late 90s when we were both at Shell in Aberdeen. And I think it's been remarkable in the last year in particular, and I don't know what extent it's all tied around COVID and we're all been stuck at home, how there's been a real change in the discussion within the energy sector. It's barely a day goes by without opening a newspaper or finding online something around energy transition and somebody doing that and somebody doing this. And I think it's quite remarkable. And I think it's gone, not to obviously underestimate these people, but I think it's gone way beyond the sort of discussions from Greta Thunberg we've seen in the last year. With Bill Gates has published a book. Mark Carney was the Reef lecturer on the BBC at the back end of last year and said some very wise words on this and other areas of finance. David Attenborough is actively involved, and I don't think he was early in his career. In fact, I think in the past there's been some negative comments about him. I think that there's been a real sea change of that. In the last year, the major oil companies have all come out and increasingly said that they're going to start investing in the energy transition, whether it's Shell spending a lot of money on hydrogen, Equinor, former company formerly called Statoil, have also gone very big into renewables. And even people like Exxon, you look at their adverts now, and they now talk about how much carbon they capture each year. So I think that's just been a remarkable change. And I think there's some very positive things in there. I don't think we should underestimate how far we've still got to do, to achieve this target of net zero by 2045 in the case of Scotland is still a huge ask. And I think it's a huge ask for all of us here, because I was looking at it this morning, I was thinking of doing some work at home and plumbing work. The plumber we go to, there's nothing on it about electric powered heat pumps or anything like that. It's still very much focused on gas and oil boilers. You look online and think, what sort of car am I going to buy? What's the range of it going to be? There's still a lot of challenges for all of us. I think we're making good progress, but I don't think we should underestimate the huge steps we've still got to take. And I think, and I tried to bring this out in the paper this morning, there's three areas, as always, we should be thinking about. One's technology, one's government policy, and one's finance. And I know David will probably talk a lot more about finance later on. The technology side, I think that's really interesting as well, because I think we've made so many leaps forward in technology. This grossly underestimates something. I'm only a mere geologist, not an engineer. There's been huge steps forward made in many areas of the technology in the last few years. We see that in Scotland. Many of you might have seen the announcements in the northeast, the work that a company called Blue Dot and Starega are doing, St Fergus, around large-scale, industrial-scale carbon capture and storage offshore. That's progressing. That's also progressing in Humberside in the northwest of England and internationally as well. And I think we're on the real brink of demonstrating that at a really large, meaningful scale. In Scotland, another issue that's arisen recently is around hydrogen, and a lot of support from the Scottish government. I'm sure we'll come back to this as a discussion later on. And Nicola's forum that she chairs had a few talks recently on hydrogen. And there's been some very positive steps there. One specific example, Scotia Gas Networks, working with the Scottish government, are basically looking to supply hydrogen to homes in Leavenmouth and Fife. So this is taking out natural gas. You need to change some of the boilers and burners in the house, but actually you can put hydrogen into the grid and those will become hydrogen-powered homes. Now, assuming that you've generated the hydrogen in a way that's not producing CO2, that's a truly green way of decarbonising your grid. And that's a remarkable change. The company I work for, our chair that we've recently started up, H2 Green, we're also looking at green methods of generating, supplying hydrogen to heavy goods vehicles and trains. And then obviously there's other things that are ongoing. There's a long-term plans around wind farms, tidal energy in Orkney. You might have seen there was a turbine launched from Dundee to go to Orkney last week. So there's lots of different areas where Scotland is actively involved, and hopefully, as Chris said, not going to miss out in the same ways we missed out on, say, the construction of wind turbines, which has been a real loss for the country. So I think in technology, there's been huge steps forward. I think Scotland's playing an active part. I think in government policy, we're also in Scotland playing a leading role, with things like a clear statement on net zero by 2045, money committed by the Scottish Government. But again, I think there's still a long way to go. I think we need to be looking at, how do you help individuals to make those choices about electric heat pumps at home rather than automatically going for gas boilers. And I think, and I've said this in this paper and said this previously, I think the other big gap in the Scottish Government's current policy is around nuclear energy. And given how important electrification is, not just in terms of what we currently use electricity for, but also electricity for cars and decarbonising many of the industrial processes, the amount of electricity we're going to need will dramatically increase over the next few decades. And I find it really difficult to see how you do that without having nuclear energy. And this is obviously somewhere the Scottish Government are in a different position from the government in Westminster. And the final part is around finance. And again, you've seen some major strides, both in terms of companies investing money in a lot of these sectors and the financial sector getting behind this as well. You've seen people like BlackRock making very public statements about where they think money should be going in the coming years. So I think there's, in each of those areas, technology, government policy and finance, we're really seeing the coming together. Still huge strides to make, still a lot of progress and actually work to be done on the ground, but I think a lot of positives in the last year. And I think fundamentally, climate change is the biggest issue affecting how we think about energy now. I don't think the contrary to that isn't true. There's obviously a lot of other issues in relation to climate change other than just energy. But at least for the talk this afternoon, I think what we should be focusing on is thinking about decarbonising and the energy transition for the energy part of the story.
Okay, thank you very much. Next we have Nicola Gordon, who is president of the Scottish Energy Forum. So over to you, Nicola.
"15 months into the pandemic and I still haven't mastered the mute button." Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Stuart. And it's an honour and a privilege to be with you all this afternoon. And the first thing I can say is I agree. And I want to take a positive approach and start really thinking about young people and essentially about the power of social media. And this isn't about shaming people because we don't all live as hermits, but it is about social norms consistent with sustainability, the right thing to do. And there's more and more understanding of what those right things might be. And we can all look back and say, well, these days everybody wears a seatbelt. Nobody thinks twice about smoking in shared places, in shared spaces. This is about setting different expectations and accelerating the pace. And I will leave politics to the politicians, but I know that here in Scotland, 16 and 17-year-olds can vote and may be more engaged in the future of society. In the last couple of days, we've brought forward the carbon emission targets the UK set for improvement since 1990, which can only be good in terms of reaching emission reductions, which will allow us to get to grips with climate change. So it's good as far as it goes, and we may be halfway or maybe not quite to what we said we would do. But just I want a quick look at how we got there, or how we got here. I have a couple of observations. UK carbon emissions have reduced hugely, but a significant component of that has been because we've outsourced our manufacturing industries to China and elsewhere. That's had a lot of local societal impacts, but energy is embedded in our way of life and our prosperity. Every car or bicycle is made of steel, mostly produced with cheap coal or gas, somebody. So making the UK look good in terms of emissions doesn't solve the global problem and gives us issues around jobs and other things. Another observation I would make is about the transition from coal and oil to gas. That is a very significant component of the progress that the UK has made so far. And as a result, we've burned a lot less CO2. It's a useful step on the journey. And it still is a useful tip, because every ton of coal or barrel of oil burned where we could have used gas has had twice the impact on the planet. So even on these islands, that's still important. But internationally, it's a lot more important. And so we have to be careful about ruling out any move to gas as an interim measure as we move towards longer term solutions. The lowest carbon available fossil fuels can be important in the short term. Now, any look at how carbon gets into the atmosphere shows a pie with loads of different segments, 3% for flying, a bigger slice for agriculture, et cetera, et cetera. And the totality needs to be net zero. So we need to have a look at the whole of it. A global challenge with local responses. It's about what difference do I make, do you make, does she make? It all adds up. Energy use will continue to grow because there are more people on the planet. And for example, even where there are low increases in the population, more refrigeration per head will be there, whether it's to reduce food waste, which also helps on the carbon, or to provide medicines. So we need a lot of changes in the energy supply, and that needs to be across the board. I'm an engineer, part of Scotland's tradition of engineering. I believe in science and technology as a force for good. You know, we can look at the Industrial Revolution and know that it led to less poverty, quality of life improvements, but now we're requiring it to be in a more sustainable way. So there's absolutely a huge and important role for technology innovation, just as Stuart has said. And just as the workers from the 5 coal fields brought the skills to kickstarting the oil and gas industry back in the 70s and 80s, onshore and offshore, a just transition for many who've started out and made careers in oil and gas will support future innovations in Scotland. And there really are opportunities for technical leadership, whether it's in carbon capture and storage or in the tidal power, et cetera, et cetera. To make all of this happen, we need to do more putting a value on the planet, or put it the other way, put a cost on introducing CO2 into the environment. Currently, we tend to use it for free. The kind of cap and trade arrangements that we have, there are a lot of different mechanisms, but we need better mechanisms and we need more of them. Nobody's yet identified the ideal approach, but that kind of carbon tax approach sets the right tone. It creates a new dialogue. It moves the dial on the right thing to do, and it helps us to make the right choices when we make investments. We need to think about value for money in terms of value for money per carbon reduction. So we're trying out a lot of options, and that I think is part of the theme of learning. And I think the theme of learning is how we are going to accelerate. We're going to need to try some things, not all of them will work, but we will learn from everything. If you do something new, 2 things happen. Either it works or you learn something. Either way, it's a step forward. And I want to see us take more of those steps forward. You know, whether it's planting trees and growing more algae and seagrass, you know, nature-based interventions are going to be really useful, including not destroying what we already have. And of course, we need to electrify with low carbon electricity. The value on the environment and the cost of carbon will also help on a more technical point around inefficiency or efficiency. The green hydrocarbon developments are important, but the thermodynamics of moving energy from between these methods means it's a resource intensive thing to do. It will be important for appropriate applications, key niches like the industrial processes and the heavy haulage that Stuart mentioned. But we can't expect to flick a switch and have Scotland operating on hydrogen instead of North Sea gas, nor should we want to. But changing to many new forms of energy brings new considerations. We can talk about the industrialization of the countryside, or what may be called that, whether it's with solar farms or with windmills, drilling of wells to supply geothermal energy, the mining of metals for turbine blades. More steel and concrete is required for offshore wind farms and for tidal power, and we need rare earths for panels and batteries for storage or vehicles. There are difficult issues in here. An example would be cobalt, allegedly in short supply. But hundreds of potential sites for mining cobalt exist in Europe. We just don't agree to build new mines in Europe anymore. At least with extractive industries, in contrast to fossil fuels, once we've dug up the minerals, in principle, we can reuse and recycle them, get into the circular economy. And this is another area where learning how to do it is very, very important. And in Scotland, in the same way that the sources of the carbon emissions are so wide, so are the changes that we can and must make for the future. We've done a great job already in terms of so much of the electricity we use most of the time is low carbon. But 40% of Scotland's energy use is for heating homes and workplaces and other buildings. And just about all of it is gas or other fossil fuels. So we have a long way to go. We have a lot of old buildings. I spent much of my career living and working in Scandinavia, and they have different ways of doing it. Now, this isn't about cutting and pasting to here, but it's about stimulating ideas and seeing what lessons can be learned. I've lived in heavily insulated wooden houses in Norway, entirely powered by electricity. They have no domestic gas network. In Denmark, district heating is the norm, where efficient central boilers use waste heat and increasingly are powered from renewable sources. But then again, probably not by bringing wood chips across the Atlantic in diesel-powered boats. So finally, back to our own role. It may sound banal and boring, and it's certainly not new, but the things about insulating our homes, installing efficient, up-to-date systems on new builds, even the stuff like don't fill the whole kettle up when you need one cup of tea, reducing the waste of high-carbon food like meat, and the one about getting us all back onto public transport. All of these things will be important in Scotland's energy transition. Each of us is an important segment in the pie because every individual has a carbon footprint. I'm positive and optimistic, and because our future depends on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Now, I'm told that David is lost to us currently. He was having some tech problems earlier, so we might have to come back to him when hopefully he rejoins us with those sorted. So I'll just go on to questions at the moment until we get David back. And Stuart, am I right in saying that there has been an acceleration in innovation in the past few years, maybe even the past year? I'm not the opposite of an expert on this stuff, but I was aware, did some work at the Green Investment Bank before it was privatised. And when we talked then about carbon capture and energy storage and things like that, they weren't quite pie in the sky, but they seemed a long way away. The technology hadn't been proven yet. It was something that the Green Lobby would laugh about because the industry would always suggest this was coming and there was no sign of it really breaking through. And yet suddenly we've gone from the theory to reality to perhaps profitability, or certainly on the cusp of that. So what has been the cause of this? Why has there's been sudden acceleration towards a new era of technology?
Yeah, it's a good question to ask, Chris, and I think Nicola will add to this as well. I don't think it has been sudden. I think it has been gradual over the last few years, and I think it's come from a number of different angles. I think we have got more comfortable with the technical solutions that actually, we may leak CO2 once we've stored it, but actually we're increasingly confident that once you pump CO2 onto the ground, you will be able to store it, whether it's in old gas reservoirs, like is being looked at by Pale Blue Dot of St Fergus, or whether it's in saline aquifers offshore. I think we're increasingly confident that we'll retain the CO2. So that's one part of it. I think the other part, I think the other big part you said there, it's still not economic, fundamentally for the reasons that Nicola said, that we don't have the correct price on carbon. So you can continue to put CO2 into the atmosphere, and for many people, there's still very little cost to that. So why on earth would you try and capture it and then take it offshore with all the costs involved in that and store it underground? So it's still not economic. It could well be in time, in the very short term, in certain industries. So under the new emissions trading scheme that Britain's now got, which largely mirrors the EU trading scheme we were in, the carbon price has increased quite dramatically over the last couple of years. I think it's about $60 a tonne now. So that is a rapid increase. And that's probably getting to the sort of price that for a lot of industries that produce a lot of CO2, so steel, for example, it does get to the point where actually storing the CO2 offshore in old reservoirs does become economic. And I think that fundamentally, that's the biggest part of all this. how do you start having the correct price for carbon that actually does mean, not just encourage, but will mean that people will make the economic decisions to actually capture the carbon and store it, or probably even better, not create the CO2 in the first place.
And Nicola, is that, Stuart has some optimism there. Is that something that's shared by your members, I guess, the sense that it's coming and it's going to get better quicker?
Yeah, I agree. I think most of many of the technical issues are solved or close to being solved. There are some scale up issues, and there will, as always, when you move into an area, when it goes from being a bit of a niche, a bit of a minority interest, to being something that's a big deal, there will be lessons to be learned. But the key issue is making the economics work, making it all hang together. And that will follow from how much we want it, that those targets that have been set. And I think what's interesting here is which things you pick. How do you choose to invest? Where does the energy, the energy in terms of the activity, where does it go? As Stuart says, the carbon trading will help to determine that.
And is all new technology starts more expensive than it ends up, and on things like wind and wave, we've seen a reduction in the price where it's competitive now with the old style energy provision. Do you have the sense that will be the same process when it comes to things like carbon capture and energy storage? It'll just take a bit of time to get there.
No, absolutely, and it doesn't need to take a lot of time, because if you look on a global scale, there are plenty of examples, where we can show that these things are working, and so I mean it's the scaling up thing is interesting, because multiplying something by a factor of 10 every year is a really hard thing to do, if you think about it in those terms, and so we need to really get going so that we can properly accelerate so that we can really deliver what we need to deliver by 35, 45, etc.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing here, Chris, you asked, you were in Scotland, so an interesting Scottish perspective here, but with the capability that we've got here, some of the leading projects in Scotland, the capability we have in the oil and gas sector and in subsea engineering, you have to think that this is an area where we can have a global influence. And I think what's interesting is one of the aspects of carbon capture and storage that's come up. This is probably not going to be a sort of disparate, this will happen absolutely everywhere. Which gets back to one of the points Nicola made about we generally live in not very well insulated houses in Scotland, where we rely on oil and gas to heat them. We're not going to have carbon capture and storage in every single house. This is going to be centralised, so that's why it's so important we do it on a big scale at places like Grangemouth or Humberside. But if you can learn the lessons there, well, you can then go and apply it to the Gulf of Mexico and South China and the big industrial centres around the world, and you really make it work. I think that's where there's a real opportunity for us with our engineering and oil and gas expertise to really apply that internationally.
And it's great to hear that, and it does take us back to a point I made at the start, and you mentioned as well, Stuart, that sense that Scotland somehow missed the boat with renewable technology the first time round. I mean, we were out there boasting about our high waves and our strong winds, and it was going to be a great opportunity for a country with Scotland's natural resources, but we ended up in effect becoming consumers of Scandinavian and Teutonic technology rather than selling stuff to the world. So do we have a sense of why that happened, why we missed the boat on that? It's obviously added real determination now to make sure it doesn't happen again, but what went wrong in those early days?
Well, some of the Nicola lived there, some of the earliest huge advances in wind came from Denmark, because the Danish government invested in early on and had very clear targets on what it was going to do in terms of, and of course they have a bit of oil industry, but not as big as Scotland's, and fewer other natural resources. So they focused on that as being the way forward. They saw the requirement for renewable energy on a climate change with climate change concerns earlier on as well. So they backed at certain clear targets, had financial support behind it. Whatever is 80% of Denmark's energy and electricity is now generated by wind. And on the back of that, some of the companies of there have become the biggest producers of wind turbines in the world. So, and that doesn't happen quickly. That's happened over the last 30 years. But it's very definite. That has been guided in that case by the government.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I agree with all of that, and I would say that there are opportunities still. Absolutely, the Orkney research, which and more that Stuart mentioned, is important. We also we should mention geothermal energy and the opportunities there, and also the clever stuff that's going on using heat from old coal mines. Combining sort of Scotland's industrial heritage. The piece that says looking for the energy from sewage, because there's heat in that. There are lots of clever things which may not look as flashy as giant carbon capture and storage $1 billion of investments, but lots of that stuff. And I think that's my point about the plurality of things, is that there isn't going to be a world where, today, so much of Scotland's energy is driven by gas. We're going to be moving to a world with a lot more different things going on. And in some of those, I've every reason to think that Scotland's engineering tradition we will find opportunities, and also places where absolutely the skills that we have from the North Sea as part of that just transition will contribute to accelerating to the greener future that Stuart's been describing.
Mm-hmm. And Nicola, just when we talk about the Scottish economy, we try to be aware of the scale of what we're talking about, and that a country of Scotland's size can't be good at everything. We're not the United States, we're not the European Union, we're a small northern European nation. So we have to think hard and pick and choose what we're going to focus on to be our, I suppose, our shop window to the world. When we're talking about renewables and this new generation coming through, what are the areas that Scotland should be focusing on in terms of development and that will bring economic growth and jobs and exports and that kind of thing?
Gosh, that's a good question.
That's why I kept quiet for a second.
Just make something up.
I suppose you could say something about the market and
yeah.
what's. But I certainly don't have a fully formulated answer to that one.
Okay. Well, let's move on to some questions from the audience, because there's quite a lively discussion going on. We'll start with John Glenn. Are you with us, John? I presume John's iPad is you.
Yeah, I'm here.
Hiya. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I wondered to what extent we need to revisit how our planning system works, because my experience, the biggest single difficulty in getting the adoption of new technologies is our planning system and this tactic of holding each other to hostage, whether it's access or whether it's infrastructure holding other parties hostage. We make it uncompetitive.
And John, do you mean that's the planning system, onshore planning system, in terms of accessing land to do things, or what?
Yeah, it's well, not just onshore. It could be just as complicated offshore. But our planning system makes everything tortuously complicated, and by the time everybody's had their hand in the cookie jar, it's no longer competitive.
And John, you wrote a paper for us recently on land use reform after Brexit and after the CAP and whatever, and touched on the role that energy provision might play in that. So you see it as being quite a big part of the future land use of Scotland, and is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have a lot of potential, and we have a lot of land, but we have a planning system that is not focused on how to deliver these things.
Yeah, And I think, and you're right, John. I thought your paper was really interesting. I just read it a couple of weeks ago, and living, as I do in rural Perthshire, we see that writ large around here with the number of wind farms that are built, but also, some very large estates with, their specific use of land and land management locally here as well. So I think one of the big challenges you've always got there is how do you, this is sort of stating the obvious, isn't it? How do you mirror and manage local people's genuine concerns with bigger strategic aims? I live just beside a very large 79 turbine wind farm that was installed about 12 years ago. Can you imagine, the locals then were completely up in arms about how disgraceful this was. But actually that went through all the appropriate, and it took a number of years, went through the planning process and was approved ultimately by the Scottish Government. Now, actually, ironically, and I wouldn't say this, I need to be careful when I say this locally here, actually, that's a very well-sited wind farm that actually, despite the scale of it, you don't really see from any areas round and about just because of the way it's done. I think it's actually a well-planned, well-delivered project. But of course, you've got a bunch of people, and this isn't obviously just as simple as NIMBYism. It's people who are genuinely concerned about the local area, and I think that's always going to be a conflict you have in planning between the local concerns and the national strategic framework of pushing forward, whether it's huge wind farms or whatever it is you're wanting to do. That notwithstanding, I think you're right. I think there are areas where we could simplify the planning process in lots of different ways and make it an easier process at a local level with councils, and for bigger strategic themes at a national level as well.
And not just wind, all the technologies.
Oh yes, absolutely. I was using wind as one particular example, but you're right. The same goes for whether you're wanting to plant trees or build solar farms or whatever else, or indeed offshore wind farms as well.
Okay, do you have anything to say there, Nicola, or shall we move on to the next question?
I should move on, I suggest.
Yeah, okay. Keith MacDonald.
Hello. Is there do you think there's likely to be a substantial export market for Scottish electricity from either tidal or wave? The Greens have been saying that Scotland has 25% of Europe's renewables. Well, I'm not at all sure how they calculate it, but I assume that that's the sort of thing they're talking about. Is that anything like a realistic figure?
Maybe I could, but I mean, I think we're going to need to use a lot more electricity in Scotland. If we talk about the 40% of energy is currently used for heating, which is all coming from fossil fuels, that's going to have to be, electricity is going to have to power. So we need to double at least the amount of electricity that we're currently using in Scotland. You can make assumptions about tidal power and offshore wind and geothermal that could lead you to a place where Scotland can generate more than we need to use. You certainly can. It's certainly one of a range of scenarios over quite some years, I think. But I certainly wouldn't rule it out.
Yeah, and indeed, in the same way as there's electricity cables being laid from Scandinavia to northeast England at the moment. For us to import electricity, I think probably it moves on to scale of, and you see that obviously in this country as well, as you move to more forms of energy like wind and solar, which obviously don't generate electricity all the time. How do you balance the grid as a whole? And that's obviously, that's a serious and significant challenge. Some of the developers are looking at that. I think now many of the bigger wind farms have, for example, battery storage systems or potentially hydrogen storage systems alongside the wind turbine, so that if you're generating electricity at times you don't need it, well, you store the electricity and put it into the grid. And of course, that grid balancing will become increasingly challenging. So being interconnected with other countries, whether it's us exporting or having the opportunity to import as required, I think is a really valuable infrastructure to have.
Okay, thank you for that. There really are some great questions here. Ed McFarlane, you can go next.
Hello. So just
Hi.
it's a quick question. So my background is a system safety engineer, doing work in a number of sectors, including the new hydrogen sector. What I'm kind of interested in is all the non-technical stuff. So it's all the kind of logistics of safety regulation, the training programs for all the personnel we need to maintain and manage these systems through life. What needs to be in place? Then there's a whole that feeds into education, a whole load of host of other areas. We tend to fixate on the technology because it's tangible: the wind turbines, the batteries, the hydrogen storage. But there's a much wider, broad infrastructure questions to be answered. And where do you think those challenges are, and how can they be overcome?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and indeed and this is obviously me plugging my own company now, but it's exactly the sort of things we're going through with H2 Green at the moment, which is, we're wanting to use various city centre sites to store hydrogen. Now, quite a lot of these city centre sites historically had town gas, and it's quite an interesting aspect as well, because there you did have, historically, pre the arrival of North Sea gas, you had local networks, and I never realised this, you had local networks of gas supply. Town gas has up to 20 or 25% hydrogen in it. So a lot of, in the past, all these appliances will now have changed. A lot of these appliances had quite a lot of hydrogen, were using a lot of hydrogen historically. Interestingly, there are certain places in Scotland that still have local gas networks. Some outlying towns like Ullapool and Wick and Thurso actually still have their own local networks, and they're actually supplied by truck. They supply gas by truck to these local areas, which was something I only discovered a few months ago. But to return to your actual point, Ed, I think, so what we've learned there is, well, what is the part of the planning rules if you want to store larger volumes of hydrogen at a site? And they don't exist. There's COMA regulations that say one thing, but they're not really planned around hydrogen. So I think you're absolutely right. There's a lot of that. Then, as you said, I mentioned it sort of in passing, the issue around changing our homes to either have electricity heat pumps or potentially hydrogen. Well, plumbers in this country are obviously all focused on installing gas and oil boilers for home heating. Well, that's going to have to change if we're going to decarbonise and electrify homes. Where are all those people going to come from? There has been some support put in there to encourage people, but it's not, I think it's not stable enough and long-term enough that, if you were a young gas boiler installer, you would think, yeah, what I'm going to do is change my career to heat pumps right now, because I just don't see the future there. We have to be in a position where your new plumber decides, yeah, I'm going to make my future in heat pumps, because that's the way this whole industry goes. So I absolutely agree with you. I think there's a lot of questions to be answered about all that other infrastructure, not hard infrastructure, but softer support, governance, jobs and training that we need to put in place as well.
Yeah, maybe to add to that, I think you can draw an interesting parallel with some of industries in the past where Scotland has been very successful, actually in oil and gas, which is that one of Scotland's exports has been our safety systems, our approach, the infrastructure, the accreditation, how we've organised that, and that in itself is quite an interesting sort of export market. As if we can get it figured out, it's something that we can help others with. But building off our kind of credibility in some of those spaces.
Mm.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, Ed. Well, it looks like David from the Scottish National Investment Bank has had a complete technical meltdown. So I don't think we're going to get him back, which is a real shame. Obviously, it would have been good to know what their thinking was. And I had especially wanted to talk a bit about the investment climate. Now, in David's absence, we do have Alistair Ross here, who has a question about patient capital and other things. Alistair, do you want to pose your question to the people we do have? Are you still with us, Alistair? Maybe not. Well, I'll tell you what he says. He says climate finance will be a central theme of COP26, and Stuart touched on the approach of BlackRock and others. The Association of British Insurers has identified an additional £95 billion of investment, which could be released from pension funds for low-carbon infrastructure. How well connected is industry to these sources of patient capital? And maybe we could expand that a bit just to talk about what the marketplace is like at the moment. You know, we've got the National Investment Bank coming on stream to probably work away in areas where there is a need for investment, there may be a slightly more sensitive stage of development and can't necessarily get the money from the private sector. But what, could one of you talk to us about that, about the state of play in terms of investment and funding, whether patient or otherwise?
I think it's a really valid question to ask, and I think you can probably answer it one of two ways. So one is new capital, one is existing capital. I think the existing capital is a really interesting part of why major oil companies are a really important part in this transition as well, because it's them that have, you know, they still generating a lot of cash. They, in many cases now, are looking to invest that capital in bits of the energy transition, whether it's hydrogen or elsewhere. And I think that's why they're a really important part of this. And if they can galvanise other people to invest, then so much the better. I think there are sources of capital. I think a lot of companies are very savvy in this, because a lot of the people that are in these industries in these smaller companies have come from other industries, very used to raising money. You know, Storiga is an example I've mentioned before. Storiga, now the parent company of Pale Blue Dot. Well, the guy who, the CEO of Storiga, was an oil and gas person, sold at least 2 companies, and oil and gas companies in the listed companies, so very well aware of the public market. And in a very specific example, so H2 Green, which I chair, is part of a company called GTEC, small listed company. And about 5 weeks ago, when our market cap was about 9 million quid, we raised £6 million on the market, with the 2 key aims of that new money being investment in hydrogen, investment in geothermal, which Nicola has mentioned. I think that's a set of new investors, often enterprise investment scheme or venture capital trust people that came into us as a new venture. You know, the share price has gone up dramatically since we made those announcements. But I think that, to me, that's a real positive indication of the money that is out there from investors. And those are, being those sort of investors, EIS and VCT, it is longer term capital back as well. But I think that's a really positive indication that somebody like us can raise about, you know, 2/3 of our market cap to invest in exactly the sort of industries we're talking about.
Do you want to add anything to that, Nicola?
I think the signs are all there, and the money is there for good projects. But we're still, I think, the carbon tax, or the lack of carbon tax, or the patchiness of the way that we price using the environment is we're going to need that more and more, as we need to get to the point where we need to be more discriminating. For the time being, I mean, as the point Stuart made earlier, how do you make things economic? And yet there is capital that's looking for, and again, this comes around to the point of the expectations that are being set by society, which is that we make this stuff happen. And that's why the pension funds are looking for places to put their money and looking for good projects. I mean, I'm not looking to finance projects, you are, Stuart, but it sounds as if the right good projects are attracting investment.
Yeah, and I think we've seen that change. And this is slightly different, but I hinted at this as well in my article. You know, there's been a huge change in the ownership of the North Sea over the last 5 to 10 years. And I remember when I was at Dana, I joined Dana in 2003. Dana was a listed company, but at that time there was had only been one private equity investor in the North Sea, and that was really small scale. Private equity investment now dominates the North Sea, and any new assets that come in now, that's oil and gas. But equally well, these people are talking about the sustainability, the longer term usage of assets in the North Sea. They're much more aware about reducing the direct CO2 emissions from their operations in North Sea as well. So I think that's new money that's coming into the area that will be looking for other places to invest as well. I'm excited by that, and that's intriguing as well.
And what is the role for organisations like the Scottish National Investment Bank? So, for example, the Green Investment Bank seemed to me to be performing a really healthy function, which was to invest in green technology that was probably quite an early stage, too early a stage for private enterprise to come in and fully fund it. So by the state, in effect, stepping in and guaranteeing, half the money or whatever, the private sector would get the confidence to come in there. And that worked in terms of maybe some technologies like offshore wind or wave power, or whatever it was at the time, that are now moving towards being self-sustaining markets. What do you think the role of the National Investment Bank should be?
Yeah, I think it's, as you described, I think it's standing alongside and supporting the money that's being invested by the private capital. We had, I was on a discussion this morning about a particular opportunity we were looking at, and it's probably riskier than we would like to take on ourselves, but having somebody alongside you like them, patient capital, would be very useful. I think, and Nicola made a point earlier as well, I don't think it's up to them to decide this is a particular technology that we want to invest in, or even worse, this is a particular company we want to invest in, just as a direction from right up there. I think it is about spreading your bets, looking at a range of technology and a range of companies. And yeah, I think we need to accept as a country, as investors in that bank, that some of them obviously are not going to work, but that stage in the technology and that stage in the life cycle, we should expect that. But the ones that do win, hopefully win big for us. So I think it's not about picking particular winners. It's trying to spread around to a variety and a range of different investment opportunities, different technologies, and then see where the winners are within it, and then win back the winners at that point.
Well, certainly in my conversations with the investment bank, they are quite sensitive to that, I think, and don't want to be seen as the state picking winners, and a return to that kind of thing. But speaking of picking winners or even losers, Steve Halliday, you have a question about Grangemouth.
Yes, hi everybody. I got a question which is, if Grangemouth refinery becomes uneconomic due to the expected reduction in demand for petrol and other components, and if they're reluctant or can't invest in carbon capture, should the Scottish Government support it, i.e. subsidise it, or let it go?
Yes, I think they should support it or let it go.
Come on.
Thank you, Steve.
That's okay, it's a pleasure.
How are you doing? I don't think the Scottish Government should be supporting anything like that directly, in direct ownership, whether it's Prestwick Airport, Grangemouth refinery is my own personal view. I don't think that's the role of government. I don't think that's a short-term issue. Obviously, we will be using petrol for a long time, and you're well aware, Steve, the other uses of the hydrocarbons that are refined at Grangemouth and other refineries, used in a whole range of industries. It's what 30% of a barrel of oil is used in, plastics and all the other uses of oil. So I think there is a long time scale for them still to be there. Therefore, I've written in the past, I find it, Nicola sort of hinted at it as well, I do find it amazing that the INEOS import ethane from the United States that's been fracked in Pennsylvania, put in a tanker and then brought across the Atlantic and brought to Grangemouth as being the best source of ethane, which I do find quite remarkable. But so my fundamental point would be, no, I don't think the government should, probably more for philosophical reasons than anything else. But I think it's a long time before we need to start considering that question.
Yeah, I agree. But I think that there is something to be said here about this thing about, do we need one in Scotland of everything, or not? And this thing that says, well, why don't we just shut down, for example, shut down the Scottish oil and gas industry, well, or shut down our refineries. But there's a thing that says we're part of the planet, and there are reasons to have some oil and some gas. Even all of the 2050 predictions show that. And there is something that says that you might want, we can do quite a lot of low carbon fossil fuel in the North Sea, relatively. And do we want to do that? And recognizing that we have quite a well-constrained framework with regulations and safety considerations, and shutting down our industries in favor of importing things from places where it might be less controlled, may or may not be the smartest move in terms of achieving the overall objectives.
One of the things you mentioned at the start, Stuart, is the elephant in the room, which is nuclear power, and the Scottish political narrative seems to be against that, against nuclear in every and any form. But there is a real risk to our energy provision and the cost of our energy provision and the stability of our energy provision if we don't have nuclear as part of the mix. So what do we do about that? Is it something that the government is going to have to fold on in Scotland? Is it something the UK government will just have to crack on with and have battles about? Or can we get to the stage where we don't actually need nuclear?
Yeah, so I think we do need nuclear long term. I think it's because we will need so much more electricity, and we will need a baseload capacity there that will have gone when we've only got one thermal electricity producer generator now in Scotland. Once they go, where's the baseload capacity going to come from that provides that stability of the grid with a lot more electricity required? I thought it was quite telling that, I don't know if anybody's read the recent Bill Gates book, but he's very strongly in favour of it as well. So I'm only piggybacking on a great mind like his. And he's not necessarily just saying the fission that we've got in the nuclear fission that we've got at the moment. We will look at new technologies and we invest in new technologies. But I think it has to be part of the energy mix going forward. I'm not quite sure, and I've not really had it fully explained, why the Scottish government in particular, and as you said, the broader political landscape in Scotland seems to be against it, because we have had, the first commercial nuclear plant in the UK was in Scotland. We've had developments, obviously, Dounreay, looking at fusion. We've had a number of nuclear plants since then that, in general, people seem happy with. I can only imagine some sort of conflation with the use of nuclear energy for military means. Is presumably why certain people are against it. But I think it's got to be a critical part of the energy mix going forward. Mm-hmm. How you persuade people of that, I don't know. I'll probably be successful as persuading people as the importance of having fracking in central Scotland.
Yes, it feels a long time ago now. Underground coal gasification. I remember that well. Nicola, do you have any thoughts on the nuclear issue?
I think there's certainly a debate to be had, and one of the things that the Scottish Energy Forum, the organisation I'm currently leading, is all about promoting energy discussion and debate. And I think there's a lot more discussion and debate to be had in the nuclear space.
And I think you mentioned England, and of course they are, they're currently building, a long way through building one, and are close to approving a second large nuclear power station. And it's just, the scale of these is just so enormous. Now, of course, the downside is at the moment they're also very expensive. They're significantly more expensive than wind, but presumably the price will come down on those as well. There's a small number of that generation of nuclear power stations that have been built anywhere in the world. So again, you'll see the cost benefit of that with time as well.
Okay, well,
sorry, Chris, I was just going
one last thing,
with my favourite, one of the favourite statements I've heard over the last few years, which was in terms of nuclear energy. Nuclear energy experts think the risks are very low, but the public think the risks are very high. Climate change is exactly the opposite way around. Most people in the general public don't see a particular issue with climate change, but any experts are really, really worried about this. And it's quite an interesting mirror between the two of them.
Well, hopefully conversations like this do something to...
Yeah, the last few months have certainly shown that understanding risk is something that we can all get better at.
Indeed, indeed. Well, before everyone heads off to the pub, which you can do now, I want to say thank you very much to Stuart and Nicola for all of that, and to David for his valiant effort to join us. I presume the National Investment Bank will invest in some good technology so that it can speak at events like this, but he was missed, and hopefully we can return to the issue at some point in the future. I'd like to thank everyone for attending, not just this event, but all the previous policy events, and also thanks to our partners at the Scottish Policy Foundation for their support in producing the research and staging the events that we have over the past month or so. We have one more event before next Thursday's election, and that's at 1:30 on Wednesday this week, when I'll be interviewing First Minister Nicola Sturgeon. As you can imagine, attendance is going to be high for that one, so if you do want to join us, get your acceptance back to Catherine as soon as possible. And I'll just finish by saying, as you know, Reform Scotland's a small charity, and we only exist due to the generosity of our supporters. So, you know, if you've enjoyed the past month or so, please do think about making a donation of whatever scale you can manage. It allows us to keep these things going. It allows us to keep our doors open. It allows us to commission research of the quality that we've done over the last few years. And you can find out how to do that on our website, or you can just drop us a line, and there the begging bowl is put away again. So thanks again to Stuart and Nicola, and thanks again to you, and we shall see you all again soon. Thank you very much.